thanks very much, folks, for coming, for joining us for this webinar here. We've got quite a number of people who have registered to come in from around the world, actually, from Malaysia, from Southeast Asia. I think Bridge, we also have some people coming from, I think, Senate, I think, one of the staffers. I don't know. Yeah, I'm not sure whether that person showing up. But yeah, it's true. It's real sort of like wide sort of range of people coming in. And we thank you very much for spending time with us this morning, this evening, depending on your time zone. But thanks for joining us. America's strategic and defense shift, what it is and what it means for Malaysia, with Elbridge Colby. Let me just introduce Bridge, as is known. He is co-founder and principal of the Marathon Initiative. Prior to that, he served as Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Strategy and Force Development. This was 2017 and 2018. It might have been over a year, just over a year or 2 years. But in that role, he made something he was involved in something quite monumental. Ladies and gentlemen, what was happening essentially was that the United States was very much focused on counterterrorism, wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, so on and so forth. Very counterinsurgency-minded sort of defense strategy. And that document sort of like provided this real sort of like, real nudge for the defense establishment to sort of like shift the principal sort of focus not away from, but maybe less emphasis on the counterinsurgency stuff, but more on the great power competition stuff. So this document, the National Defense Strategy of the United States of 2018, I wish the full document is out, but we can read sort of like a declassified summary, right? Is that it? It's quite something, but also quite something, and maybe it's just as good as the declassified version of the NDS is his book. So Bridge has written a book called The Strategy of Denial: American Defense in an Age of Great Power Conflict, published by Yale University Press. The Wall Street Journal has selected the book as one of the top 10 books of 2021. So this is how we're going to do it. I'm not going to read the whole bio, Bridges for whole bio. You can go to the Marathon Initiative's website for it. It's long. Bridge is very accomplished, and So, but in any case, I would also encourage you to read all the other stuff that Bridge has written. He has a great Twitter account which he updates very regularly. But we have him here today, and Bridge, maybe you can do about 10 minutes of our initial remarks. We'll have a conversation after that, then we'll open it to Q&A.
Great.
Over to you, Bridge.
Great. Thank you, Shahriman, and great to see you. It's been a couple of years since we've seen each other in person, since I had the privilege to be in Kuala Lumpur. So hopefully we'll be able to see you in person before too long and visit Malaysia again. But it's really a pleasure to be able to talk directly to you and your colleagues, and also an audience in Malaysia, and I understand beyond, but obviously focused on Malaysia, which is such an important country in the Indo-Pacific and Southeast Asia. So, I'll sort of briefly outline the book and sort of what I was trying to do, and the strategy that I try to sort of conceptualize in it. Basically, the book is motivated by my profound concern, which honestly right now is almost being reinforced, which is that American foreign policy and sort of strategy, while there have been sort of rhetorical and strategy level shifts towards more prioritization, for instance, in the National Defense Strategy of 2018, in practice, we are tending to pursue this sort of post-Cold War policy of what you might say heavy multi-theater dominance, a very sort of leading and heavy role, not only in Asia, but in the Middle East and Europe. and the sort of, maybe the Robert Kagan idea or the John Bolton idea or what have you. But that the fundamental reality is that the scale of threats in the world, potential threats that the United States and its alliance network face, are just greater than that traditional, sort of post-Cold War model can sustain. And in that world, I think it's rational and appropriate for the United States to reassess its overall strategy and adapt to that world. And that's particularly the case with respect to war and peace. I mean, given the consequences and the stakes, it's more important than anything else that we have a rational, military strategy and defense strategy. And so that's what I set out to do. And in a sense, Shahriman kindly referred to my experience in the Pentagon. I mean, this is, I call it the platonic version of the 2018, and no compromises, no, this is just me talking. So I'm sure some of you who have government experience know what I'm talking about, or worked with the government. But basically the strategy, I call it the strategy of denial. And denial has two main meanings. The first is a geopolitical meaning. And so, I believe that we, particularly after the collapse of the Soviet Union, the United States essentially became unmoored from a sort of reasonable conception of its strategic goals in the world. I mean, of course, the most famous or infamous would be President Bush talking about ending tyranny in the world in his second inaugural, but incredibly expansive and ambitious ideas about our role in the world, and, global policeman and sort of global sheriff, if you will. And I just don't think that's sustainable, nor do I think it's really advisable. So, okay, what is? I mean, and there basically I go back to an idea that you find in writings like Nicholas Spikeman or something, but basically the kind of, I think, pre-1991 idea that actually was ascendant certainly in the 20th century in the United States in practice, which is an anti-hegemonic approach, basically. You can think of it as kind of a variant of the balancer approach, traditional balancer approach, to deny a regional hegemon that, say, Great Britain played in the balance of power era, before the First and Second World Wars. But basically, the logic here, and this is a point I make very regularly to American audiences, is the stakes are enormous, because if a country, the United States is about 20% of global GDP, so we're uniquely powerful along with China, but we're not sufficiently powerful on our own to dominate the rest of the world. So if some state is able to agglomerate a sufficient degree of, GDP is a sort of a proxy. I mean, it's obviously a simplistic metric, but I think there's not a better one. But basically enough of global power, well, then it would be able to set up a geoeconomic system that was in its favor and not in our favor, and it would be able to coerce us in our national life. And I think, we can sort of see that already. But if you look at the world in that way, well, then you're concerned about where's most of global power and wealth, basically GDP, productivity, and where are the countries that are most powerful. And you just look at a map and it's East Asia. And so now, and that means Asia is the most important region of the world. I mean, Asia is going to be more than 50% of global GDP. And by the way, I'm not just saying this as an Asian audience. I say it to Americans and Europeans all the time. And by far the other most important state in the international system is China, which is also about 20% of global GDP, and that share is increasing. Both of those shares are increasing. The second most important region, other than North America itself, which is basically important because of the United States, is Europe. But Europe is shrinking as a fraction of global GDP from something like 20% now, 25%, to something like 10% according to the EU itself in about 20 years. And the most powerful state in Europe is actually not even Russia, it's Germany, if you look at GDP. So if you think about, okay, where is there a potential for a state to agglomerate power and use it to try to have a basis for coercing us, well, then it would be China and Asia. And that's a sort of a theoretical deduction, but I think, and we can get into this, but I think it's pretty clear to me, and I think to most people in the US at this point, certainly in the US policy world, that China is pursuing regional hegemony at a minimum. I mean, it's building a military to do it, it's acting like it, its stated aims are very expansive. So that leads me to say, well, our top foreign policy priority needs to be to deny China hegemony in Asia. And that's for Americans' own interests, but I'll get to why it aligns with others in a second. And then second, a significant second is Europe, but it's definitely second. And then a distant third is the Persian Gulf, which is kind of, the rest of the Middle East is not that decisive. I mean, just if you look at where global GDP is concentrated. Okay, that's our fundamental strategic prioritization. If that's the case, how do we do it? Well, we're not strong enough on our own, and we're very distant from Asia. So we ourselves alone cannot realistically take on China in the contest over Asia. I mean, there's not sufficient American resolve. Capability tends to attenuate over distance. So basically, we need to work with other countries that have the will and capability, or excuse me, the will and the power to stand up to China, to resist China's domination of the region. And fortunately, there are lots of countries in Asia in particular, naturally, because Asia is where people are most affected by this potential outcome, that do want to resist China's hegemonic ambitions. Now, and I think this is very relevant to Malaysia, now those countries tend to be one of sort of two things, usually the same, basically the second tier of powerful countries or China's immediate neighbors. So Japan, Taiwan, South Korea is a little iffy right now, but I think over time, South Korea will move more in our direction. More quietly, Vietnam, but certainly within ASEAN is one of the firmer lines, and India. And then Australia is a little bit of a special case, but for reasons I think people can intuit. But those are the sort of key countries in this anti-hegemonic coalition. China naturally wants to take India and Japan down a notch because they're the primary regional challenges. And of course, countries like, when we talk about Taiwan and Vietnam, the ones that are immediately feeling China's new power and sort of aggressiveness. So working with countries like that, and I'll get into exactly how, I think we can have an anti-hegemonic coalition. And again, the goal is negative in a good way, which is to say it's bound together by its shared negative goal, which is preventing China's dominance. It's not imposing a particular way of life or ideology on everybody else. It's basically saying something that I think is very consistent with nationalism, which in Southeast Asia, and I think most places, is a good word, and I think is a good word, which is to say people, countries and people should chart their own future on their own terms. Well, this is basically a pro-nationalist kind of anti-hegemonic idea, because sure, there's Chinese nationalism, but what they're trying to do is impose their will on others. So this is basically the core idea, is the anti-hegemonic coalition. Okay, so far so good. In fact, in a lot of ways, this anti-hegemonic coalition is already coming into being. Yes, the Quad, but also things like AUKUS, the Japanese-Australian relationship, closer ties with Taiwan, et cetera, et cetera. That's all good. The problem is that I think Beijing, if it is resolute about pursuing its goal of regional hegemony, which I think it is, and I think China has very strong reasons to pursue regional hegemony, and actually we're probably seeing some of the evidence right now, which is their interest in getting out from under US dominance of, say, the international financial system. And I mean, we can get into that, but I think China's interests in establishing this position are very deeply rooted. It's not simply a feature of Xi Jinping. We might have a successor leader who's more like Deng Xiaoping, but the fundamental structural incentives would still be there. Happy to talk more about that. But I mean, I don't think in Asia, it should be a very controversial comment to say that China wants to have a dominant position. I mean, I think it was Yang Jiechi who said, right, at the ASEAN, regional forum 10 years ago, you're small countries and we're a big one. That's how you're supposed to behave. So that logic, I don't think China seeks a territorial empire, probably, other than the annexation of Taiwan, but it does seek a dominant position where countries will have to orient their security, their geoeconomic, their sort of high political decisions around Beijing's preferences. So if China does want to pursue that, how does it go about doing it? Well, what I'm most worried about is China's best strategy. I'm not so worried about dumb strategies that we would readily be able to resist and that I don't think China will pursue, because I have tremendous respect for Beijing and their decision making. I think they are very savvy. So what I worry about is what I call the focused and sequential strategy, which is to say, if I were advising Beijing, what I would say is don't precipitate a conflict with everybody like Adolf Hitler style, and then bring everybody in and then catalyze the will of the American people. Franklin Roosevelt's famous speech after Pearl Harbor, you have awakened a sleeping, or I think it was Admiral Yamamoto said, we have awakened a sleeping giant. You don't want to do that. You want to achieve your goals without a full-scale war. And the example here might be what the wars of German unification, where there were relatively small conflicts that led to a systemic transformation of the European balance of power. So in this case, I think what China would want to do is try to collapse or short circuit, if you will, this anti-hegemonic coalition without fighting a large war. And how could it do so? Well, I think it would best do so by isolating members of this coalition, essentially making an example of them, and then causing a run on the bank of confidence in this anti-hegemonic coalition, and in particular in the role of the United States, because, and I'm not boosterish or sort of preening about this point, but only the United States is strong enough, of course, to play the leading role in this anti-hegemonic coalition, because only, Japan could not stand up directly to China. Even India, can't stand up directly to China, certainly in a regional context. So if this is the case, this is what I'm worried about. Well, then this anti-hegemonic coalition needs to be resilient to China's strategy. Now, a lot of this is going to take place in the realm of non-military power. And in fact, I think the Chinese are basically trying to use non-military power to achieve this goal. I mean, they are attempting to make an example of Australia right now. Now, fortunately and commendably, they are thus far failing. In fact, it's having the contrary effect. And I actually think the experience of the last few years suggests that Chinese attempts to use its economic leverage, people talk about Belt and Road and all the other forms of investment that the Chinese have, their attempt to turn that into very concrete and decisive political leverage has tended to be disappointing, if not counterproductive. There was an article in the Wall Street Journal about like even Kenya, a developing country where the Chinese have tried to do that, and that has catalyzed an internal response within Kenya, kind of a nationalist response. And so this is, the Indians have kicked out a bunch of Chinese companies, and of course you're seeing this all, boycotts of Chinese goods or imports and so forth. And I mean, again, the Australians are the kind of more singular example. So I don't want to say that economic leverage doesn't matter. It does, but in our experience, it's also been that economic leverage is very limited in terms of really getting somebody to do something they don't want. Look at our North Korea, Cuba, Iran, Iraq, pretty limited goals or results from even pretty severe sanctions. And I mean, we may be seeing a variant of this right now where, it's too soon to say, but the Kremlin is continuing the invasion of Ukraine despite really significant sanctions. So, and that's an offensive goal. That's not something, they're not being asked to give up their, territorial integrity or something. So that's all good news because that gives us confidence. But what it does, and I think I'll sort of touch on this more briefly, but it points to the centrality of the military power in this issue. And I think it's pretty clear by now, hopefully, that I'm looking at things through a kind of a realist lens, like a classically realist lens. And, as Chairman Mao said, power comes out of a barrel of a gun. At the end of the day, the most effective form of coercion is lethal force. And if the Chinese are serious about regional hegemony, which I think they are, then they will be at least prepared to countenance the use of military force. And they have built a military not only to try to resolve the Taiwan issue, but increasingly to project power throughout the region. So it looks like a military that is designed to basically give them options to pursue not only the focused and sequential strategy, but to take on the United States directly. And they're openly practicing attacks on U.S., not actual attacks, but practice attacks on U.S. forces that are visible from Google Earth. So, or Maxar, what have you. So in this context, what is the problem? This is why I tend to be, for those who follow me on Twitter or something, I'm so concerned about the military role and the situation over Taiwan, because I think what China's incentive is in this context, if it wants to short circuit the anti-hegemonic coalition, is to use military force to decisively subordinate a member of the anti-hegemonic coalition, which is a kind of informal grouping, but particularly one that is connected to the United States by something like an alliance connection. which is to say, including Taiwan, basically. Because paradoxically, the way to collapse the coalition is not to attack people around it. This is what the Russians have done. They've attacked people who are not members of NATO, and that strengthened NATO, right? So what China would want to do, I think, is to attack someone connected to the United States, because that would show that we are hollow, that our credibility is hollow. And if China could do that once or maybe twice, and I think after Taiwan, it would have an incentive to look at something like the Philippines, then it could basically be in a position where everybody would have to cut a deal, right? And the balance, the geopolitical balance in Asia is pretty, there's not a lot of buffer, because China is so strong, and China has natural allies like, of course, Pakistan and Cambodia, which are more worried about India and Vietnam, respectively. So there's a pro-hegemonic coalition, if you will. So this really orients, and China has the capability, it has the focus, and it particularly has a strategy. And so I write a lot in the book about the fait accompli. Basically, China's incentive is to fight a sort of a limited war that could be a relatively large war in military terms, but the goals and the scope of the war would be relatively limited at the end of the day. Create a new set of facts on the ground and make it impossible for the Americans and our allies to reverse the situation. And of course, I think the first most propitious target is Taiwan, which of course they've been working on for decades. But as I said, they could continue onward. So for me, this means the military piece is central, and the military balance in the Western Pacific must be central to our foreign policy. And so this is what animates so much of what I'm trying to do, and the book itself. I think I know, Shahriman, we're going to talk about this. What I would say to this audience is, this is going to sound like a pretty hard, in a way, a hard line. I'm a hardliner, but I'm not. I'm not trying to. I'm not sort of a neoconservative or something. I'm not trying to transform and subordinate China or the rest of the region to our sort of Pax Americana. There's a sort of indirect Pax Americana, but our goal here is a stable balance of power in which China is going to be exceptionally powerful, but doesn't have a sort of theory of victory, economic, military, or otherwise, to subordinate other countries and then basically be in a position where China is the huge dragon, and then there's a bunch of little, animals around it, and it can just pick off everybody at will. That's what we don't want to have, and that needs to be the focus of our efforts. And so I think, part of the thing that in this context, the anti-hegemonic coalition, I think is particularly relevant in Malaysia, is I'm really focused on, and I think America really needs to be focused on working with countries, essentially forming this anti-hegemonic coalition out of countries that naturally have the interest and the will to play a meaningful role. So I am not, we were joking before, I don't think this is a John Foster Dulles, Pactomania kind of situation where we're expecting everybody to sign up. And actually, frankly, one of my criticisms of the current administration is I think they have this sort of Three Musketeers idea that everybody should be on the same, if you're a democracy, you should be on our side, and wherever we are, if it's in the Falkland Islands or the Aleutians or whatever, it doesn't matter. No. My basic view is countries have interests, they have a level of power that scopes their frame of reference, and the countries that are going to be willing and able to work with us are the ones that are powerful enough, like India and Japan, or they're directly threatened. And then by the same token, though, we've got to play a more sort of, I would say, conservative or prudential role or diplomacy with countries like Malaysia, like Indonesia, that are behind the front line. That essentially you are protected from immediate Chinese action by Laos, Thailand, and or going through the South China Sea by Vietnam and the Philippines. Now, all I would say at this point, I think maybe the biggest takeaway here. So in a sense, I don't think we should be pressing Malaysia for like an alliance or something. To the contrary, I think we should frame our policy towards Malaysia more modestly. But I will say that I think that the Chinese power is going, we are going to be very surprised in the next 10 years or more how present and real Chinese coercive power is. Of course, economic, but also military. I was shocked when the news reports came out that the Chinese were thinking of building a base on the Atlantic coast of Africa. That's really, even the Soviet Union was barely doing that. So I think if we're thinking 10 years out, I think the relationship and the dynamic with Malaysia may be different. But at this point, it's more of, I think, understanding kind of where we're thinking. I think right now with what's going on in Europe, there's a real danger that we get pulled back into Europe, which is important, but is secondary. A priority is a priority, and the primary interest has got to be Asia. In my view, if China seizes Taiwan, our position together with Japan and India and Australia will be gravely, gravely damaged. And in fact, will probably necessitate that we take a more demanding posture towards the ASEAN nations in order to compensate for the loss of our credibility and essentially the power of Taiwan, which is one of a large economy, sophisticated economy, semiconductors, military capacity, et cetera. So I'm really focused on trying to get us to hold the line, not a change in our political status on the resolution of the Taiwan issue, same thing, but meaningfully substantiating our traditional position that we are opposed to China violently resolving this issue to its favor. So with that, I look forward to the discussion and any questions. Thanks.
Thanks very much, Bridge. And as my colleague has typed in the chat window, please do submit your questions on the Q&A window, and I will try to answer them. But Bridge, before we go to the questions from the audience, just several questions. First, right at the end of your book, you talk about something called a decent peace, and I just want to read something that you wrote here. What is this decent peace? All it asks of China is that it leaves aside any pretensions to hegemony over Asia. China could proudly live in a world in which this strategy has succeeded. In other words, the strategy that you have described, China can proudly live in a world in which this strategy has succeeded. It would be one of the greatest nations of the world, and its preferences and views would command respect. It would not be able to dominate, but neither would the United States or anyone else be able to dominate it. Could you elaborate a bit? I thought that was very profound. Because when I began the book, I was expecting, something else. But this is something. Yeah. What
no, thank you for. I'm glad you raised it, Shahriman, because I very deliberately ended the book with that. I could have ended on any number of notes, and that's the one I wanted to end on. And I even talked about. I don't talk about any personal things in the book. The one exception is at the end. I talk about that I lived in what's now China. I've traveled to China, and I'm actually several generations of my family have had connections to China. So this is not any kind of anti-China animus, but I wanted to communicate to the Chinese, honestly, but also to others that this is not about, this is not about a kind of a domineering sort of ambition for the United States. And I should be clear, there is a strong domineering strain in American foreign policy thinking and action. So I'm actually struggling against that. I get criticized a lot. People even call me like an isolationist or something for some of my arguments. But my view is that, we don't need to insist that China be something less than what I'm talking about. And I think it's very important that China understand, because many Chinese leaders and so forth are not going to be happy with the situation, but I think China could be very pleased. I think if I were writing this book and, if Deng Xiaoping took the time to read this book, he might say, well, I don't like all of it, but I could live with this kind of situation. And that, I think, is better than the alternative, which is a war or wars. And so, I was pleased. I think I mentioned to you that, I actually did have a chance to have a direct conversation with some people from the PRC about this, and they did actually take it in this spirit. And I'm sure there are others who are not taking it in this spirit, but but I think that's important. I also think, my impression is in Asia that, and this is one of the reasons I like to work in Asia more, that there's a bit more of a pragmatic and kind of realistic approach to politics, and different countries have different systems and different cultures, and kind of people are look after their interests and make money and whatever, and that's sort of expected. Whereas in other parts of the world where American foreign policy is involved, it's very almost this kind of ideological. I mean, I don't want to say, well, there is an element of crusading involved, but this is a different mindset and a different strategy that I'm trying to advocate. But again, at the end of the day, I mean, both the United States and China are going to be so powerful that if we get in a war, and certainly a very large war, it would be a truly a disaster. But we have to protect our interests in that world. But I think it's important for China and for others who might be involved with that, we might be engaging with, because we were asking for support, to understand what we should be really trying to pursue, and that's not sailing into Tokyo Bay in 1945, that kind of thing.
But Bridge, you call this a classical realist approach, and I'm just wondering having read this passage here, what a decent piece, where China can be a major power, can be a respected power, and so forth. Are you calling for a concept of power, a condominium, where what is the role of the rest of us in that?
Yeah.
Right? Should the US see Southeast Asian countries as mere appendages to this broader strategy to create this equilibrium with China? There is this criticism that in Washington DC you don't really see Southeast Asian countries as engagement with Southeast Asian countries is only instrumental towards doing something with regards to China, rather than engagement with Southeast Asian countries themselves in their own terms. What do you say to that?
Well, I would say, look, I think American foreign policy should be oriented on Americans' own interests, in the same way that I'm sure Malaysian foreign policy is about Malaysians' interests. Now, we're a very large power, and we should take an enlightened view. But the reason that we need to look at everything through the prism of China is because China is the primary problem. It's the most powerful state in the system. It's not anything particular about China. If China were, actually one of the things that the Chinese interlocutors I was talking about is, yes, it's very interesting. We could just call China country C, and the United States would be country U, or, and that's actually the right, it's a little bit billiard balls, but it's, I think it's actually, it's a rational and logical approach that people can then see how they would fit in and what they can realistically be asked of and what not. So, I don't think, of course, we're everything with Southeast Asian countries, but actually with European countries, and they bridle at this as well, how does this fit into our strategy towards China? That's the priority, right? So we've got to reshape, even things domestically, we have to reshape. Our industrial policy, some of our trade arrangements. So it's not that I don't think that we should be shy about, what the basic sort of why we're doing that. That's not that. The other thing I would say is I'm not the G2 kind. Look, Kissinger is a brilliant, really just an exceptionally brilliant and perceptive, but I find a lot, as I get older, kind of unsound thinker on a lot of things. And I think his record over time will not hold up well in terms of his statecraft. But one of the areas where I think it is like this kind of the bizarreness of a realist who is such a believer in a kind of a condominium with a primary rival. Which is essentially, he was the one who would always critique the idea, the importance of summits and stuff like that, and optics. But it's like, well, instead, what we should be doing is we should be building a position of strength with countries whose interests are aligned with our own. That's the realist position. And then we can have a détente, in my view, with China. But we can't have détente until we're in a sufficiently strong position where they're obligated to respect our position, because I don't think we're there yet.
Right. So this is not about sharing power in Hugh White's term, US-China sharing power, and the rest of us simply have to sort of like follow toe the line, basically.
Right.
Right. So we'll move to questions a bit, but one last one before we move to the audience questions. Ukraine. This everyone's talking about it. You have tweeted some views about how this is probably going to really come at a cost to US presence in Asia. That there is only so many kit that can go around the world, and there is no unlimited kit for the US military. So how does Ukraine perhaps change your strategy? How does Ukraine make it more or less achievable?
Well, it doesn't really change my strategy at all, because the strategy is not predicated on the idea that Russia is a satisfied or sort of constructive actor. I mean, I in fact, in the book, later on in the book, I actually talk about potential scenarios where the Russians do invade Europe, and we can't, do both. Even then we have to choose Asia first. So I am an Asia first, not because I like Asia. Well, I mean, I do like it, but it's not that I have some affinity for Asia over Europe. It's that Asia is the world's decisive theater. So and that's the key thing. What I'm worried about is that the Ukraine tragedy, the aggression against Ukraine, is triggering elements in the American political system and sort of the political and policy and intellectual elite that are deeply sort of transatlantic oriented. That even though there are these people like me who talk about how we need to prioritize Asia, culturally and sort of sociologically, the orientation is the transatlantic relationship. And they basically think, and I frankly think the president thinks, that Europe is the most important. I think that's like empirically wrong. Well, I think there's two things about that are empirically wrong. One is that Europe is essentially more important than Asia. I just don't think that the facts bear that out. And secondly is that we can sort of have a dominant role in both theaters. And I think there's a gross underestimation of what China represents. I mean, China is 10 times the economic size of Russia. I mean, Russia is obviously a threat. We're seeing that right now. But I mean, like China has, and I mean, I don't need to tell a Southeast Asian audience about the sort of the presence and influence of China. But I think that this is very worrisome. And I think this will be a critical time. I think it's possible that we avoid getting sucked back into Europe. And this is, we're not even talking about what might happen over Iran. But I think it's a very serious situation, because we know from public sources, public Defense Department, other sources, that the military situation in Asia vis-a-vis China is bad and deteriorating. So, that's where we need to focus. Awesome,
Bridge. Thomas, do you want to take over? Thanks.
Sure thing. Thanks, Shahriman. Folks, just before I get into the questions from the audience, just a reminder that we do appreciate your questions or your comments through the Q&A tab. It doesn't strictly have to be a question. It can be an intervention or a comment. If there's something that Bridge said that you agree or disagree with, by all means, plonk them in, and we'll definitely try to address them. I think we have about maybe 30 odd minutes to sort of address most of these questions. So do put them in. Bridge, I'll start off with one, at least one question from the audience, and then we'll sort of take it from there. So this question is from Charlie Brown. Hi Charlie, and Charlie's from Booz Allen. So his question concerns the current posture of US forces in the Indo-Pacific, whether there needs to be a change, in particular when it comes to access to ports, to airfields and logistics, in countries that are US allies, as well as other countries that might not have such assured access arrangements in place. How can this be done in a right way that would benefit both the US and these other countries as well, if you have any takes on that, Rich?
Yeah, no, I think it's critical because the military, the sort of scope of a conflict with China is expanding dramatically as Chinese military power grows. Obviously, the range of missiles and so forth, but also their power projection forces, their ships and aircraft and submarines, their space reach. So I think that unquestionably we're going to need sort of strategic depth in our posture, and a lot of that is what's going on in, say, the Central Pacific or Australia, and of course Japan. I think, my view is this is, in a sense, what I'm saying, hopefully will kind of situate some of the conversations that are going to be, say, in the ASEAN context, where obviously there's going to be a lot of resistance to this kind of thinking, but where over time, I think it will be in countries' interest to have at least the option to be able to work more closely with the Americans. I mean, if you're, for instance, Indonesia, right now, you have no interest in probably a very close military relationship with the United States. But if the Taiwan were to fall, for instance, and the Philippines were to have a government that switched, the situation would be very different, where say, let's say there were Chinese bases in the Philippines, let alone in Taiwan. Then Indonesia would face a much more direct military threat. Of course, the Chinese have already been doing things over the Natuna, for instance. So this is not theoretical. But the problem is the time that's required to to build this access, this interoperability, and so forth, is greater than the amount of time that might be available. And so even if I were an ASEAN country that did not want to provoke the Chinese and did not feel particularly threatened right now, things could move fairly rapidly. And I think the Ukraine situation should show to us all that if a great power country like Russia builds a military, says it really cares about something and is willing to use force, we should kind of take them. I mean, we invaded Iraq mistakenly, in my view, but it's happened. And I mean, the Chinese are building a military to obviously go after Taiwan, but they're also building a lot of military capability and posture in the Indian Ocean, East Africa, et cetera, Pakistan, so forth. I mean, at least the option. So I think we need to be, if I were an ASEAN country, I would be thinking to myself, how do I start creating some optionality where I'm not left exposed to Chinese coercion if things go in a bad direction.
Right. Excellent. Shahriman, I have the suspicion that you want to jump in here.
Yeah, Rich, but I mean, having said all that, how would you respond to, say, countries like, maybe Malaysia, which has strategic culture. You saw it yourself when you were here.
Right.
You saw a bit of that when our former Prime Minister Mahathir spoke at the conference, right? A strategic culture that is quite skeptical of the West,
right?
That sometimes puts a discount on what the West says. One that tries to that puts things in, maybe draw some false equivalencies, right? That is going to be tough. It's going to make it very tough for the strategy that you outlined to be implemented. How do you deal with that?
Well, one of the things that I'm trying to do, that I think we were talking about a little bit before, that I think is different from typical American foreign policy, is I'm trying to be about things as close to what our actual strategy is as possible. I think in a lot of ways, there's certainly a perception in places like Malaysia, in a lot of quarters, that the difference between what Americans say and what we actually do is very wide, right? There's a sense that we're hypocritical, that we dissimulate, and we could debate about the particular points. But what I'm trying to say is, here's the strategy that I'm laying out is not one that's sort of like romantic and says that we're better people than even than the Chinese. I'm not saying that we're better human beings than the Chinese. I'm saying we're people too. I think our system of government is better, but I'm not saying that we're, that you should work with the Americans because we're morally superior to the Chinese. I'm saying it's in your interest. And I think that is, to me, given, and this is, I think I make this point, or I know I made this point in the book about Southeast Asia, because in a way, I think Southeast Asia, unfortunately, risks becoming the primary arena for competition because it's the kind of unincorporated area between the two superpowers, right? If we're looking at the superpower map, the first island chain is going to be a clear line where you have US allies, Taiwan included, South Korea, I think, is going to be more and more on one side, and you have China on the other. And then you have India, which is basically more and more going to be with us. But then you have Southeast Asia, which is, and I'm taking as a given that Southeast Asia doesn't want to make these choices. But the downside of being unaligned is that you risk being, figuratively or literally, a battlefield. Right. The benefit of being aligned is, the danger is you can get pulled into something that you don't want to get pulled into. The good thing is you've got the big heavy to protect you. And so I think, and I'm not trying to push the John Foster Dulles thing, but I'm trying to say, I think the predicate of what the former prime minister is sort of talking about is the sense that there isn't an immediate military threat. And the sort of ASEAN way is kind of, the presumption is that there is not an external major military power that can come in, other than basically the United States, which is, in practical terms, relatively restrained in Southeast Asia since the war in Indochina. So, and had alliances with some of the countries. But I think that's the danger, is if you kind of play it both sides, and at some point it becomes a confrontation, then you're sort of an arena, a battlefield, rather than being taken care of. And so I think and what I'm hoping to do is saying, okay, well, you can hear me talking. I'm not hiding what we're trying to do. I'm being very clear. You can see where your interests align with what I'm talking about, and work with as much of that as you feel. And hopefully you lean forward. That would be my hope, is that Malaysia would say, I see what you're saying. Here's what we can do. We're going to do as much as we can. We don't want to tick off Beijing too much, But I think that's hopefully that's compatible.
Thanks very much, Rich and Shahriman. Okay, let's move on. So you mentioned India, which gives me an opportunity to segue into, I think, a couple of questions on AUKUS, and this one on India, but then also a question of my own. So we have a question from Crispin Coates on whether the AUKUS arrangement signals something new in the US strategy, or is it just a reiteration on long-standing policies? So we've had this sort of conversation in Southeast Asia, whether AUKUS is essentially anything new, or just sort of a repeat of the old, somewhat direct form of lines that was in practice in the past, that sort of tapered off towards the 90s and 2000s, but it's now making a comeback. I've got a follow-up question to that, but do you want to take this first, and then
I can. No, I think AUKUS is very important and is very positive. I would say it's not geopolitically new, but it's a new level of collaboration on technology and on sensitive capabilities like nuclear-powered submarines. And that is significant. I think it's also a model of the ability to pool, say, I mentioned technology investments, but also weapons production that I think could be very beneficial going forward as a model, also, say, with Japan, and ideally, ultimately, a country like India too.
Okay. So the second part of the question, and I mean, this is something from Mina. Mina is a young researcher from ISIS, and I think one of our team, and I think one of her questions to do with India specifically on how do you see the relations with Delhi evolving amid recent geopolitical developments. But I want to tack this on to a question of my own. Now, I think Bridge, I think our audience might appreciate your assessment on the prospective roles of some of America's key partners, and you do touch on this in your book. But in particular, I'm thinking of the really stark development in how Japan has viewed China and the sort of statements that it's making on Taiwan now. And I'm thinking of the bilateral and multilateral relationship with Delhi, where India has to work to strategically balance against China, but at least in my point, at least from my assessment, is still somewhat anguished from the extent of its cooperation with the US. And you mentioned earlier that you don't see this as a particular issue. You said, if I'm not mistaken, India is with us now. So I just wanted to get your assessment of that.
India is a good example, though, of my approach, which is differentiated based on the situation of the country and the desire to work. So, I mean, India is with us in alignment, but I don't think India wants to become a sort of ally like we have had since the Second World War. And actually, we don't really want India to be in that situation. India is actually, in some sense, a model for what we want, because it's independent and does what it wants, but it also has a really, really formidable military and is willing to use it, and is willing to take an active and leading role in South Asia. So actually my argument in the book and elsewhere, and I've been making this in the Indian press in the last couple of weeks, is a more division of labor model. So not more an ally like in the pre-1914 sense, where countries collaborate closely, but they have pretty independent approaches. And I think, for instance, it's important that we keep India in proper perspective. I mean, Japan and India are most important relationships in the world. So whatever's going on in Europe, I mean, I think we should, press the Indians to take the proper position on Russian aggression and to condemn it. But at the end of the day, our relationship with India is more important, right? Because it's critical to the critical theater. So we should array our diplomacy accordingly. And Japan is very significant. Japan is an ally. I mean, I actually have been hammering them for the last few years to try to spend more on defense, to become, in a sense, a little bit more like India. And maybe that's going to happen. They've said some things on Taiwan. Also, the other day, former Prime Minister Abe actually talked about nuclear sharing, deployment of nuclear weapons on Japanese territory. So these are, a lot is changing very, very quickly and very significantly. And of course, the move by the Germans in Europe, also, that's actually very encouraging also, because it shows that the Europeans will step up more, which will allow us to be able to have a more reduced role in Europe over time. So that's encouraging.
Thanks, Rich. I do recall when you were in KL, I think it was in 2019, that you had a very interesting exchange with one of our German participants on Germany stepping up to do more in NATO. So it's interesting to see how sort of things have moved really fast since.
I wish it hadn't taken an invasion of Ukraine for them to change. I wish they did before, but we should applaud them in any case. So.
Yeah, that was exactly what was running through my mind when I saw the news flash across my screen. But let's go to a question by Him Raksme. Him Raksme is from the Cambodian Institute of Cooperation and Peace. He has a question on the Russia-Ukraine crisis. I think you addressed this a little bit, and if you want to expand on it anymore, please do so, on whether this crisis has changed any strategic calculations that the US has about China. His second question focuses more on Taiwan, and basically on this question of ambiguity on Taiwan. If China decides to go in by force, will the US be present to defend that? And I guess if I can build up, if we could have your particular view on, should the US be ambiguous on Taiwan? Why or why not? And what would the particular blowback be, one way or the other?
So on the Ukraine situation, my view hasn't changed. I am concerned that the American foreign policy world it may get sort of telescoped into this issue, which would be a significant danger. I mean, you're not getting people saying now that China's good. In fact, China's getting a lot of flack for being perceived as being alongside Russia, but you are getting the sense that Russia is more of a threat or equal of a challenge, and Europe is equally important. And that's a lot of the debate right now, which I'm trying to argue that, no, Asia is the most important and China's the biggest challenge. I mean, just, so that's what I'm doing. And then on the on strategic ambiguity, I mean, my view is the United States should defend Taiwan. I don't think that the United States should formally abrogate the policy of strategic ambiguity, but I think China rightfully seems to anticipate that if it invaded Taiwan, the United States would defend Taiwan. I think that's what they're rightfully assessing based on their statements and based on their military practicing that we can see.
Okay, thanks. And what would your assessment of the blowback be, if I can sort of push you on that? I mean, if the US comes out very, very clearly to state its intent, what do you foresee? So pushback from Beijing is going to be.
Well, that's why I don't think we should formally step away from strategic ambiguity. I think we're actually in a pretty good place right now where.
And it should be maintained that.
Yeah, I mean, we kind of, it's making a Kissingerian policy even more Kissingerian, which is, okay, I don't think we should embarrass or provoke Beijing by saying we're abandoning strategic ambiguity, but I think we should plan that we would defend Taiwan and that we should be prepared to defend Taiwan. And Beijing will probably understand that, but that's, it's a symbol, strategic ambiguity, and, I mean, it's like Taiwan has been effectively an independent country for whatever, what is it now, 73 years, right? But I don't think we should say that Taiwan is an independent country because it's just not, doesn't make sense for us, even though it's a sort of a reality that in many ways we all act that way. But that's part of the thing of keeping the peace is, I think, communicating to China that it would be a very bad idea to use force against Taiwan, but on the other hand, not breaking all the sort of the architecture of normalization and the sort of Sino-US communiques and so forth. I don't think we should just blow those up. Certainly not at this point.
We've got about, I think, 15 more minutes in this Q&A before we have to wrap up. We'll probably wrap up a couple of minutes before that. So if you have any folks, if you have any burning questions, this is the time to get them in. Bridge, I'm going to try and contextualize two questions that we have in the chat for you. One is from Usha, and the other one is from Jamil Ghani. And the essence of the questions really revolve around the need for Washington to really deepen its economic ties and its economic activities in Southeast Asia. So it's not to say that the focus on defense and focus on bases and sort of strategic military presence is not important. It is, but ultimately, what countries here really want and how, in a major way, in how Beijing has really deepened its influence here and its persuasion here is through, economic and development ties. And is there is there a particular approach that you see coming from DC? Because we've seen successive administrations talk about this. We've seen this from the Obama administration, we've seen this in the Trump administration, we're now seeing this in the Biden administration. There's still not been any kind of effective economic rollout or alternative that countries in Southeast Asia look to say, this gives us an option. Instead of going with Beijing, and I do appreciate it's extremely hard for DC to do. I mean, no president can call up the chairman of General Electric and say, I want you to put in $10 billion in Southeast Asia by next week, right? In a way that folks in Beijing. So I don't know if there's an answer to this. It's a particularly tough issue.
I think, this is a defense book. It's focused on defense. Obviously, it doesn't mean that the other things aren't extremely important. Obviously, the economic piece is exceptionally important. I mean, my view is we have to get the military piece right in order for the economic piece to be the center of the discussion. But it's a critical, central part of it. I would say that my basic view is we absolutely need to have a regional economic strategy and some kind of vision of a larger block of countries that can, that will be able to trade and so forth, interact with China, but also has an integrity of its own that will be able to match the scale of the China-centric market. The problem is, candidly, politically in the United States, there's a lot of skepticism about trade, and that's pretty bipartisan right now. So I think what's going to happen is somebody who has credibility on trade is going to have to convince people that it's in our interests, and I think it will be there. But we also need a kind of a different model of trade promotion, which is going to be more sort of geoeconomic, that it's going to be in the context of we're 330 million people, but the Chinese are 1.4 billion. So we can't just be one-to-one competing in those markets. And rather, we got to be able to work with ASEAN, with Europe, with Japan, South Korea, India, Australia, et cetera, that's going to be a critical part. But I mean, as of right now, I don't see a particularly ambitious agenda from the Biden administration, which is not surprising because there's not a lot of support, from what it sounds like, for significant free trade moves in the US.
Okay. So I think we probably have time for about some questions. I'm going to go to a question about China before I come back to Southeast Asia, and Southeast Asian questions are probably, I'm going to chuck Shahriman under the bus and try and get a response from him as well. But Bridge, on Beijing, I think that there's a question from Angeline that essentially that essentially states that, in her view, that there is a clear misunderstanding in both DC and Beijing about each other, about their motivations, and about the way they sort of move forward on that. And do you think this misunderstanding can be bridged, or do you not think that there is a misunderstanding at least?
Yeah, I don't think there's a misunderstanding. I mean, I don't think we understand Beijing perfectly at all, and vice versa. But I think they have, again, this is, my book is not, it's consistent with deeper sort of expert understandings of Chinese decision making, but I didn't take particular positions on how the Chinese make decisions or what they make decisions on and so forth. But rather, I look at it sort of deductively from a kind of human nature, and this gets back to that classical realist point. Well, I'm sure there are many Chinese who would happily exist within the current, boundaries of the People's Republic and under the current, international architecture that exists in Asia and so forth. But there's also clearly a lot of Chinese, and it seems like Xi Jinping is one of them, who have grander ambitions and that want a more dominant position in the world. And their perception of the viability of achieving those aspirations is going to depend on the counterforce that they face, right? If they see that they have an opening and the costs and risks are low of pursuing the goals, well, people like Xi Jinping are going to have the upper hand. On the other hand, if they see the Americans, the Japanese, and the Indians, and the Australians, and others working closely together and having a lot of capability, they're going to be more likely to be deterred militarily, but also in how, if they see that in this context with Australia, if that Australia is being supported, that it's got alternative markets, it's got the Chinese are having difficulty sourcing some of the key imports they get from Australia, from other places, they're less likely to pursue aggressive and ambitious goals. And so that's the sort of I don't think it's misunderstanding so much as putting the right set of incentives for the Chinese, and so that they're incentivized to act in the way that I talked about in that decent peace section that Shahriman talked about.
Okay. So I'm going to come in with what I think are the last two questions here. This is for for both you, Bridge, and for Shahriman, and then I might hand it back to Shahriman to wrap up the conversation today. So I'm going to try and combine this question from Zul Hilmi and a follow-up from Charlie. Zul talks about how Southeast Asian countries have long used an assortment of hedging strategies to maximize benefits that it can get from China and the US. I wonder, based on your assessment, Rich, can we continue doing this for a long time, or is the space for us to hedge and to balance, rapidly shrinking? And what do you think this means for Southeast Asia? I guess the same question goes to Shahriman. And I know, Shahriman, we've been having like lots of conversations about this before among ourselves. So it'll be great if we could sort of hear some of your unfiltered viewpoints on the webinar. And the second, please, go, Rich, go for it.
Well, I would say, actually, one of the benefits I think of my approach is that in my successful world, there is trade, quite a lot of trade probably with China and mutual. There is decoupling in those areas where China would have the ability to use that as meaningful coercive leverage over us, but that's still consistent with quite a lot of commercial interaction. So I actually don't think that we need full-scale decoupling, any of us. Countries need the degree of decoupling from China that's necessary to preserve their national autonomy and independence. So that's good. I think for countries like Malaysia and Indonesia, that maybe even Thailand, that there's still certainly space for playing both sides. I mean, I'm not going to lie to you. I mean, I think there's still, but I think it's definitely riskier. And I think being, again, getting caught in the middle is a dangerous place, especially as the relationship is bound to continue to be or get even more confrontational. It's going to be a difficult situation. And of course, to really play both sides without alienating one or the other is very difficult. So I think it's, I haven't given a lot. I mean, I think, to me, I intuit very strongly the incentive to free ride, which is to say not to get directly involved in the security competition, but free riding and sort of playing both sides are two different things. Free riding, for instance, the Netherlands is kind of a free rider in NATO, but it's not perceived as being friendly to Russia before, the last week or two, right? That's a different problem. Whereas a country, like Hungary, that was perceived as playing both sides, is much more animosity created. And so I think that is going to be, I haven't thought it through well enough, but I think that's going to be a riskier proposition. I mean, I'll just be honest, actually, I was born in Singapore, but like, I have to say that I have really bridled at some of the rhetoric coming out of Singapore in the last few years. Now, part of that is because the expectation, certainly my expectation from Singapore is higher. I always thought that Lee Kuan Yew, while he could be very critical of the United States, there was always a sense that he was basically with us, in my sense. And that is, at least publicly, there's a different vibe that comes across right now. And, that's going to have, I mean, I'm just one person, but I'm sure other Americans are talking about, in fact, I know other Americans have noticed it. So, that's an example of where, what does that mean down the road? Well, we'll see. But I think it is going to be a riskier and trickier strategy.
Ray, do you want to give this a go?
Yeah. So let me try to answer the question. Basically, this is the age-old conundrum about having to choose and so on and so forth, right? That's basically it, right? So, look, I think just to supplement what Brish has been saying, and look, I think that we will be in a position of being able to say, oh, we want to choose country A or B under a certain sort of like threshold of intent. I mean, under a certain threshold of competition and conflict, right? So we can still choose. We can still say, we prefer A or B, or prefer to say that we do not choose when there is a certain level of when we have, some say. I'm not answering this very well, am I? But so in those kinds of situations, under that certain threshold, I would say that we should choose based on the situation, based on who is being most, more or less unhelpful to the situation. But I really worry when the intensity of the competition goes beyond that threshold. And I think that we will not be in a position of choosing. The choice will be made for us. And I do not think that we will be in a position of choosing when we spend less than 1% of GDP on defense, when we are still flying Hornets we bought in the 1990s, Sukhoi 30s that are probably going to be very, very difficult to maintain now, ships that are made everywhere in the world, including those with which we have territorial disputes, ships that are not yet delivered after years and years of a contract with a local company. I do not think that we will be in a position to choose if we continue to underspend on defense as we continue to. The choice will be made for us. Yeah. Thanks, Thomas.
Thanks. Bridge, I know it's late. It's 11:40 p.m. at your time. But if I can just put one more question to you.
Sure.
Yeah. Great. Okay, so I'm going to read this question out in full. It comes from Yu Wang. So I'm just going to try and read this out as full as I can. So Yu Wang is interested in your logic and the reason for the US to rebalance against China's regional influence. He says if China's true intention is to seek mutual respected cooperation rather than so-called dominance in Southeast Asia, would the US change its strategy to cooperate with China and to improve conditions in the region? And on another issue, he would like to know your views on what he calls US dominance in South America. And following your logic of the US strategy in Asia, is it then necessary for Europe, China, and Russia to rebalance against US influence in South America? So, Bridge, if you can.
It's an excellent point. It's actually something I addressed in the book, is the charge of American hypocrisy. Paradoxically, countries like Malaysia have an interest in a hypocritical America, because if there were local balancing going on in the Western Hemisphere, the United States would not realistically be able to project much power out of the Western Hemisphere, right? So we couldn't play the balancing role, and China would be, by default, the dominant power. So most of the countries of the famous comment about Mexico, from which we seized large portions of our country about almost 200 years ago, is that it's too close to the United States, too far from God. So, I mean, clearly the U.S. has had I wouldn't say not into the Southern Cone, but in the Caribbean and Central America and so forth for a very long time. And, my theory is not a theory of international law. It's not a theory that I would make to a judge about what's right. It's a theory of national interests, right? And I don't think we should go around running around overthrowing governments in Central America or anything. I have also a similarly kind of restrained view there. But my view is that, it's clearly in Malaysia's interest and in Vietnam's interest and in Philippines' interest that China or any other country, and it was the same interest that we all shared against the Japanese in the 1940s, that no country be dominant over the world's largest market area. That's another thing about Central America that's different. It's not an important enough area. So actually, if you're going to carry that analogy forward, I'm actually not opposed to the Chinese having like a dominant position in parts of Central Asia that aren't so relevant to us. So in a sense, you could have, that would be the more proper analogy. I think the first one, I would happily cooperate with China if it were willing and credibly willing to act in that way. The problem is that we can't take China's word for it. I mean, because I don't think China's followed through on a number of its pledges that were really relevant to its credibility, like not building up its nuclear forces or not having overseas basing. So we have reason to be skeptical. And even more than that, we just don't know what the Chinese are going to do. And they're really, 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 really strong. And they're getting stronger. And they're building a military and economic capability. They're using economic sanctions against Australia right now in a way that is designed to change the internal system of the Australian government. So we can't trust in China's good graces. We have to take countervailing steps that put us in a good position. But if China, for instance, if China built a military, reformed its military, not for power projection, but for just territorial defense, that would be like, in that case, I would say, look, we should really take a much different position towards China, because this is a credible step that's going to be very difficult to reverse, where they're basically, showing that they really don't have they won't have aggressive ambitions. But that's not the world that we're living in right now. In fact, we're totally in the opposite world. So we've got to prepare for that.
I was going to ask you to summarize, but I think that would probably suffice as a summary. It's almost 10 minutes to midnight where you are. Shahriman, I'm going to hand over to you if there's any last words you want to take us home with.
No, not much, Thomas. And thanks so much for doing this so expertly. Bridge, thanks very much for doing this. I think your book, people who haven't read it, I think should give it a real chance, more than a real chance. Read it very, very carefully, because I think there is a tendency to prejudge and say, oh, this is an anti-China sort of thing. No, I detected an immense amount of respect for China in your book.
Thank you.
You do not say very nice things about China. Well, I mean, it's not littered with praise for China, but there's respect for China in it. And yes. I think that this is what makes your book, I think, different from the other, the American primacy crowd, for example. And this is not a book about American primacy, at least from what I've read. Yeah. And Bridge, I hope more people will go out there. It's for all the rest of us. Go to the nearest bookshop, Kinokuniya or whatever. The book is The Strategy of Denial: America's Defense in an Age of Great Power Politics. So Great Power Conflict, Yale University Press. And Bridge is now, I guess the rest of the family has gone to sleep. sorry to have kept you.
It's been a pleasure. I just wish I were in the warm weather where you are. That's all. It's still cold here, but it was. Thank you so much for all of you. Thank you to Isis. Thanks Shahriman and Thomas and your whole team. It's really a pleasure, and I hope to see you in person before too long. Now that God willing that COVID is receding. But
absolutely. Thanks very much, Rich. And,
thank you all.
Thank you, and thank you, folks, for joining us today. Just a very quick administrative announcement. We'll probably upload a video recording of this on our social media channels by late today or tomorrow. So just stay tuned to that. And if you want to catch the recording of this, you can do so. Thank you. Have a good day and a good evening and a good night to you, Bridge.
Thank
cheers.
you.
Cheers, everyone. Bye-bye.
Yeah. Bye.